The gospel writers were simply educated storytellers. And if you read the challenge, you'll notice that there were lots of claims in that challenge, too many to deal with in this short video. But what I want to do is I want to take kind of the 5 key claims and deal with them quickly in this response video. Number 1, this challenge argues that the gospel writers were not eyewitnesses. Now, number 1, that's a claim that needs to be supported. So when someone makes that claim, I'm going to put the burden of proof back on them to support that claim. Why should I think the gospel writers were not eyewitnesses? Number 2, I'm going to respond by saying I think I have a pretty good argument that the gospel writers were eyewitnesses. And so if I know who the gospel writers are, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, then and I know these are the authors, so there's going to be some issues with kind of authorship that may have to be dealt with here. But if I know who the authors are, and obviously this challenge assumes that we know who the authors are if they're identifying them as educated storytellers. But if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are our gospel authors, well, of course, we have 2 of them who are eyewitnesses, Matthew and John. And of course, John at the end of his gospel even indicates that he's an eyewitness, that he had seen these things and is writing so that we might know the truth about these things. But then you look at Mark and Luke depend upon eyewitnesses. And Luke himself says in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, he's creating an orderly account from eyewitnesses who have passed these things down. And so that, so we can make an argument from the Gospels themselves. You can look at the book of Acts. The book of Acts, the disciples, the apostles, continually refer to themselves as eyewitnesses, so that might be part of our case. But then another argument would be the tradition of the early church fathers. And the early church fathers, in their writing, they identify these guys as eyewitnesses. And so you have someone like Papias writing about Mark and identifying Mark as not an eyewitness, but who relied upon Peter, his mentor, for his eyewitness material. And so you have early church fathers who corroborate these guys as eyewitnesses. And so the burden of proof is going to be on this person to help me see their argument why they're not eyewitnesses. I have an argument that they are eyewitnesses. But then lastly, here's another response is, so what follows? Let's say these guys weren't our eyewitnesses. Let's say I grant that they're not eyewitnesses. Does it follow that their accounts in these Gospels are not reliable? No, you're going to have to do more than simply say that they're not eyewitnesses. You could make the argument that, even if these guys aren't eyewitnesses, we have different ways to corroborate the truthfulness of the Gospels. Okay, here's the second claim. The Gospel writers were just educated storytellers and not historians like modern-day historians. Well, again, here's my question, clarification question. What do you mean by a modern historian? How would you define a historian? I mean, someone could actually say, hey, a historian is an educated storyteller. So how are you defining historian to exclude these guys from being historians? A second question, so what follows? Right? So what follows? Let me just agree that these guys are educated storytellers. Does it follow that their stories are not true because they're not historians in the way that the objector wants them to be? Or, it says that they're not like modern-day historians. Does that mean then what they've written is somehow false? Because if that's the claim, then that commits the genetic fallacy, right? The genetic fallacy is when you fault the origin of a claim and then dismiss it as false. Right? So, for instance, if I, Brett Kunkle, said, hey, E equals MC squared, and you looked at me and said, wait a second, Brett, you're not a scientist, and you dismiss my claim that E equals MC squared because I'm not a scientist, you've committed the genetic fallacy. It doesn't matter the source. The source can't tell you whether the claim is true or false. You got to look at the claims themselves, and are the claims corroborated by other things. The third claim here is that the gospel writers relied on oral traditions and not so much on written traditions. And so this, again, we need to ask some clarification questions. It seems like the assumption here is that oral tradition is somehow less reliable. And so if that's the case, I'm going to put the burden of proof on this person to give me reasons why I think we should think oral tradition is not reliable. Because then I'm going to say I've got an argument that oral tradition is reliable, and particularly when you study oral cultures, and you look how different they are than our modern culture. Because I think a lot of times on these kind of objections, we are importing our current cultural context to understand an ancient context. The oral tradition of first century Palestine is very different than our modern culture. And oftentimes I think when people think of oral tradition in the modern mind, we think of like the telephone game. And if that's what you think, you don't understand oral tradition and oral culture. In an oral culture, there was an ability to memorize large portions of Scripture. There were different things in that oral culture that the cultures would do to ensure accuracy. Okay, and then lastly, we can also again ask, so what follows? If this person is saying they relied on oral tradition and would grant that oral tradition is somehow is a reliable source of information, well then what follows? It doesn't follow that if they relied on oral tradition that it's unreliable unless they make that argument. Here's the fourth claim. The gospel writers added embellishments and mythology. Again, my first response, put the burden of proof back on the person who's making this claim. Okay, give me the reasons why I should think the gospel writers embellished and added mythology. Okay, so you've got to make that case. But then secondly, again, I can move towards this objection, say, look, let me grant the objection. Let me just grant that there are some embellishments and there's some mythological components within the gospel writers. That doesn't undermine all of the reliability of Scripture. You could have embellishments within the Gospels and still have a historical core. You see, you don't need an inerrant Bible. You don't need a perfect gospel to give you some historically accurate information. So I can still, again, grant this objection and still make the argument that the Gospels give us some historical core truths that can be relied upon. So here's the fifth claim. The Gospels couldn't be fact-checked. Okay, again, this person's making the claim. I'm going to put the burden of proof on them. Why should I think that? Because I think that's clearly false. The Gospels are written within a generation of the eyewitnesses. And so you have people who are living at the time of the writing of the Gospels who were also alive during the time of the events that the Gospels record. And so it seems to me that you clearly have fact checkers. You have people who were alive at the time of Jesus' alleged resurrection. And so these things can be fact checked by the people who are there. And of course, do they mean that these things can't be fact-checked now? Because we can fact-check these things now. We can look at the outside sources. We can look at what other people have said about that period of time. We can look at archaeology as a fact-checker, right? That helps corroborate these things. And so again, I think this claim is false. The burden of proof needs to be put on this person. And then lastly, so what follows? Let's say I grant that these things couldn't be fact-checked. Well, it doesn't mean that they're not true and that we don't have resources to fact-check them now. And so there, again, a lot more we could say, but I think these are the 5 main claims of this objection. Each of them, when we kind of isolate them, we can see they need to be backed up. But even if they're true, it doesn't mean that the Gospels are not true. The Gospel writers, what they recorded, aren't true and aren't reliable. And so we can answer another objection.